There are nights in Paris when the fog along the Seine grows so thick it seems to breathe, as if the river itself were alive and listening, holding secrets between its slow, curling waves. On such a night, long before dawn and long before Paris began to stir with the usual clatter of carts and the scent of warm bread drifting from the bakeries, Inspector Moreau stepped out of the Quai des Orfèvres with the uncomfortable sense that a story had already begun without him. The lamps along the embankment burned with a dim kerosene haze, their yellow halos trembling in the cold air. Somewhere across the water, a solitary whistle sounded, thin, metallic, drawn out in a way that made it impossible to tell whether it came from a night watchman, a distant train crawling toward a provincial station, or something else entirely. It was the type of whistle that didn't call attention to itself, yet left a strange ache behind, as if it were marking the disappearance of something not yet noticed. He paused, adjusting the collar of his coat, feeling the damp settle into the fabric like a warning. In a city accustomed to mysteries, tragedies, and passing shadows, even the smallest disturbance could become a thread that unraveled into something far larger. But this night felt different. As he watched a lone figure vanish into the fog, silent, steady, and leaving no sound upon the pavement, Moreau felt an old, unwelcome sensation, the prickling awareness that he had just witnessed the end of a story he had not yet been told, and whatever had disappeared into that mist had no intention of being found again. Some cases begin with shouts, blood, or a stranger hammering at a shuttered window. Others begin with a silence so deep it changes the rhythm of a man's breath. And standing there by the Seine, with the taste of cold river air on his tongue and the echo of that whistle lingering in the dark, Inspector Moreau knew that silence had already claimed its first victim. If you find yourself drawn into these darker corners of Moreau's Paris, where a single vanished shadow can reshape an entire night, you may want to stay with us as this mystery unfolds. Your support, whether by liking this story, sharing it with others who love these quiet, atmospheric investigations, or subscribing so you never miss the next turn, helps keep these lamps burning a little longer in the fog. The night had not yet decided whether it belonged to the previous day or the one to come. A faint gray line hovered over the eastern roofs, no more than a hint of light behind the chimneys, while the remainder of the sky stayed heavy and low. The Seine flowed in its own time, swollen by recent rains, its surface dark and uneven, catching the weak reflections of the bridge lamps in broken pieces. Inspector Moreau walked with his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his shoulders slightly hunched against the damp, as if the very air had weight. He had left the Quai des Orfèvres 10 minutes earlier with the intention of going home, of returning to his wife and a plate kept warm on the stove. Instead, his feet carried him along the embankment as though they knew something he did not. The echo of that thin, distant whistle, heard only once, still lived in his ears. Pont Saint-Michel rose ahead of him, its stone arches dark against the trembling water. The lamps along the bridge burned with that particular yellow fatigue of early morning, their flames small, like thoughts almost extinguished. Even at this hour there were traces of life, a cart rattling somewhere near the boulevard, the clink of bottles from an unseen doorway, a mutter of voices that vanished as soon as they arose. Yet the bridge itself seemed suspended outside all that. Moreau slowed his steps as he approached, aware of the familiar sensation tightening in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and reluctance. Many cases in his life had begun this way, without warning, on nights when he had intended to think of nothing more than sleep. A uniformed night watchman leaned against the parapet, his cap pulled low, his breath fogging in front of him. He straightened when he recognized Moreau, as men in his position often did, more out of unease than respect. The inspector's reputation traveled quickly along the river and through the guard posts. People spoke of him as a man who listened too closely, saw too much, and asked questions that continued to work their way under the skin long after he had gone. "You're out late, Inspector," the watchman said. though his tone carried more curiosity than reproach. "Or early," Moreau replied. "It depends which side of sleep you stand on. Have you been here all night?" The man nodded, glancing with a quick, habitual movement at the water below. "Since midnight." "Nothing to report." Moreau let the phrase hang between them. He stepped closer to the parapet, resting his gloved hands on the cold stone, and looked down. The river moved with slow authority, pressing against the piles of the bridge like a creature too large for its confines. No disturbances, no quarrels, no one leaning too far over the edge. The watchman hesitated, his fingers tightening on the strap of his lantern. "Nothing unusual." "Which means something occurred that you prefer not to call unusual," Moreau said softly, his eyes still on the water. "Tell me about it." Silence stretched for a moment, filled only by the murmur of the river and a faint clatter from a nearby street where a baker was beginning his work. The watchman shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then sighed in a way that suggested the inspector's presence had broken a fragile balance. "There was a man," he admitted. "Not long before you came out from the quay, perhaps 20 minutes ago, he crossed the bridge from the Ile de la Cité, walked slowly, no hurry at all. He stopped there." He pointed to a spot halfway across, where the stone of the parapet bore a darker stain as if it had absorbed more moisture than its neighbors. He stood looking at the water. "Did he speak to you?" "No." "Did he look at you?" "Not once." Moreau turned his head slightly, studying the watchman's profile. The man's jaw was set in that stubborn manner common to those who spend too many hours alone, entrusted with responsibility they do not entirely understand. "And nothing," the watchman said, almost impatiently. "He was there. Then he was not." "There are only so many ways to stop being there," Moreau observed. He walked away. He climbed into a carriage. He jumped. He turned back. Which was it? The watchman swallowed, his throat moving under the rough fabric of his scarf. "I don't know. I only looked away for a moment. A cart was passing. When I turned back, the man was gone. No sound, no splash, nothing." Moreau let the words settle. He had heard many lies in his career, some clumsy, others crafted with care. What the watchman offered did not bear the deliberate polish of invention, yet neither did it fit comfortably into the realm of fact. He stepped away from the parapet and walked to the spot indicated, his boots leaving faint traces of moisture on the stone. The bridge under his feet felt solid enough. The parapet reached his chest. A man leaning over would have to make a decision, an effort to climb or throw himself into the river. There would be movement, hesitation, perhaps even the scrape of leather against stone. Yet Moreau's own senses could imagine, just for a second, how someone might slide from presence into absence if the night itself were willing to assist. He looked down at the pavement near his shoes. That was when he saw it. A tiny glint, no larger than a coin, lying where the lamplight barely reached. He crouched, the damp from the stones seeping through the fabric of his trousers, and picked up the object between thumb and forefinger. It was a small piece of metal, cool against his skin, shaped like the body of a whistle, but missing both chain and mouthpiece. One side bore the faintest trace of engraving, not letters, not numbers, but a series of lines so fine they might have been the marks of a craftsman's tool rather than a symbol. "Did you notice this?" he asked, without turning. The watchman shook his head. "No, Inspector." "You're sure?" "I would have pocketed it," the man answered frankly. "Anything that shines on a bridge at night is either trouble or worth a few centimes." "But I did not see it." Moreau considered the reply, then slipped the object into his own pocket. He straightened slowly, feeling the pull in his knees, the dull ache that reminded him he was no longer young. The air seemed colder now. The faint hint of dawn had not grown. Instead, the sky pressed lower, as if the clouds had decided to delay morning a little longer. "Describe the man," Moreau said. The watchman shifted. Again, his face tightening. Average height, a dark coat, hat pulled low. He walked like a man who knows where he is going. His face? The man's gaze moved restlessly from lamp to river, from river to Moreau's collar, refusing to settle. I don't know. I didn't see it clearly. You watched him, Moreau said quietly. You saw him cross the bridge, stop, stand at the parapet. You noticed his coat, his hat, his walk. Yet you did not once see his face. It was the fog, the watchman protested, but his own voice betrayed uncertainty. The light, it wasn't clear. I remember the shape, yes, the shoulders, the way he held his hands, but his face, it's all blurred, as if... He broke off, annoyed with himself. As if it were not important. Moreau's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was again, that odd reluctance of memory to attach detail where detail should exist. He had encountered this phenomenon once or twice before, in cases where the witnesses did not truly wish to remember, or where something in the event itself had pressed too strongly against their usual habits of perception. You said there was a cart, Moreau remarked. Passing at the moment you looked away. Did you recognize it? A delivery cart, I think, the watchman said. Covered, the kind that brings goods from the halls. I did not see the name. Did the driver look toward you? No, he kept his head down. Moreau offered a faint, humorless smile. It seems everyone tonight has found reason to keep their head down. He let the remark pass without emphasis, then turned once more to the water. Did you hear anything? A whistle, perhaps? The watchman stiffened slightly. I thought I heard something. A thin sound, not from the bridge, from further off. It might have been a train, Inspector. The line toward the south, maybe. The fog carries noise strangely. Yes, Moreau said. Strangely. He remained there for a few minutes longer, allowing the river to speak in its own language of eddies and lapping waves. A warm kitchen waited somewhere beyond the maze of streets, and his wife would be accustomed by now to the delay of his footsteps on the stair. The city around him was beginning to awaken. A window opened on the Ile de la Cité, releasing a ribbon of lamplight. A bell chimed the quarter hour. The ordinary world was ready to reclaim its place. Yet the space where the unknown man had stood remained marked in Moreau's mind by an absence as tangible as any bloodstain. Leave your name at the quay, he told the watchman as he prepared to go. Someone will take a statement from you later. If you remember anything more, not what you think I wish to hear, but what truly returns to you, send word. The man nodded, his shoulders sinking in a mixture of relief and apprehension. Do you think it was a suicide, Inspector? He ventured. Men come here for that. The river draws them. Moreau adjusted his coat, his fingers brushing the outline of the metallic object in his pocket. The river does many things, he said, but it rarely works alone. He walked away from the bridge, his steps measured, cutting through streets still almost empty. The faint tune of the unseen whistle seemed to weave between the buildings, never loud, always at the edge of hearing. It followed him toward the quarter where a narrow cafe, half awake and smelling of yesterday's smoke, waited with its own quiet piece of the story. The streets leading from Pont Saint-Michel toward Rue Saint-Jacques were beginning to stir, though sluggishly, as though Paris hesitated to shake off the last remnants of the night. Moreau walked with the same deliberate pace he used when his thoughts were ahead of him, sorting possibilities, discarding old assumptions, and listening for the faint murmurs of connections that had not yet formed. He knew this part of the left bank well, the narrow lanes where students and clerks mixed with night workers returning home, the cafes where dawn regulars clung to their rituals as though routine itself could keep the world from shifting under their feet. Yet the fog of the morning allowed even familiar streets to feel unfamiliar, as if the cobblestones hid an unspoken rule that nothing seen today should be trusted in the same way as yesterday. The cafe he approached was small, wedged between a tobacconist's shop and a shuttered bookstore that smelled perpetually of damp paper. Its sign, once red, had faded into a murky brown, and the windows bore smears from countless hands, wiping condensation away to peer at the street. Moreau knew the place not from habit, but from reputation. A spot where the night's last customers and the morning's first often overlapped, creating a strange mixture of exhaustion and alertness. He pushed open the door and stepped into the warm interior, where the air held the strong scent of roasted coffee, spilled wine, and tile floors mopped too quickly to dry. Only a handful of patrons occupied the tables, 3 men hunched over their cups, a woman knitting near the window, and a young waitress collecting plates with a practiced grace that suggested long hours and little sleep. She glanced up when Moreau entered, not startled, but with the subtle tightening around the eyes that people often showed upon seeing a police inspector in their early morning sanctuary. Her gaze flicked intentionally to the owner behind the counter, a stout man with a mustache that seemed to droop under the weight of his own worries. Moreau acknowledged the owner with a slight nod and chose a table near the door, close enough to hear the street sounds, but far enough inside to observe the room without intruding. The waitress approached with a menu she knew he would not need. Moreau had no appetite, but he ordered a coffee anyway, more for the ritual than the drink. She nodded briskly and retreated to the counter where the owner poured the coffee with reluctant precision. It was not the kind of cafe where strangers asked questions. It was a place built on shared silences. Moreau understood that, respected it even, yet he also knew that silence was rarely empty. It simply waited to be approached correctly. When the waitress returned, placing the cup gently on the table, Moreau noticed the faint tremor in her hands. She masked it quickly, wiping her palms on her apron before turning to leave, but he stopped her with a soft, almost conversational tone. "You were working last night?" She paused. "I work most nights, Inspector." He gave her space to continue, but she said nothing more. Her eyes remained on the table, as though avoiding something in his expression. "A man passed through here yesterday evening," Moreau continued. "Dark coat, hat pulled low. He may have taken a seat near the wall." "That describes half the men who come here," she replied quietly. "We do not ask for names." "No, but people remember what disturbs them, even in small ways." Her gaze lifted for a moment. It was brief, but in that instant, Moreau saw something flicker there, uncertainty, guilt, or perhaps recognition. She pressed her lips together and made an effort to reshape her expression into polite neutrality. "He didn't cause trouble," she said at last. "Then it is curious you assume I'm speaking of someone who might." She blinked, realizing her misstep, then shifted her weight from foot to foot. "Inspector," she said cautiously, "I serve many customers. The ones who stay long enough to be remembered usually wish they hadn't." Moreau sipped his coffee, the bitter heat grounding him. "He left something behind," he said. "Not an object. A silence." Her breath caught, barely perceptible but unmistakable to someone trained to notice the slight changes in a person's rhythm. She folded her hands behind her back as though to keep them from revealing more than her words. "What kind of silence?" she asked. "The kind that arrives when a man is expected," Moreau replied, "and then disappears before the reason for his coming becomes clear." The owner behind the counter stiffened slightly. His mustache twitched and he looked pointedly toward the back room. Moreau's eyes followed the movement. That was the first real answer he received. The waitress noticed it as well. Her shoulders slumped a fraction before straightening again. "I should attend to the other tables," she murmured. "You will," Moreau said gently. "In a moment." He stood and approached the counter. The owner's expression closed immediately, like shutters drawn against a sudden storm. "You know the man," Moreau said without accusation. The owner wiped the counter unnecessarily, leaving streaks that betrayed his agitation. "I know many," he said. "Those who drink here are not my responsibility once they leave." "Responsibility," Moreau repeated, tasting the word. "An interesting choice. I did not ask if you felt responsible." only if the man was familiar. The owner muttered something under his breath and reached for a stack of saucers. He sat for less than an hour, he conceded, drank a single glass of wine, spoke to no one. Yet he left an impression. The owner glanced at the waitress. She stood rigidly beside a table, pretending to pour coffee for a customer who clearly had enough in his cup. The owner hesitated, then drew a small breath through his nose. He was waiting, he said finally. For whom? Someone who did not arrive. Moreau leaned an elbow on the counter. Did he speak of it? No. Did he look anxious? No, the owner said immediately, then reconsidered. Not anxious. Prepared. Prepared. The word deepened the chill Moreau carried from the bridge. He straightened slightly and allowed the silence to linger until the owner grew uncomfortable again. Did he leave anything behind? Moreau asked. The owner shook his head. Nothing. Moreau tapped his pocket gently, feeling the small metallic object he had found on the bridge. Nothing except a mark, he added quietly. The owner's eyes snapped up. They widened just a fraction, but it was enough. Moreau angled his body slightly so the other patrons couldn't see and withdrew the object, holding it between his gloved fingers. The owner stepped back as though the piece were heated. That's not ours, he said quickly. I didn't suggest it was. The light fell across the metal, glinting off the faint engraving. The waitress, who had been pretending not to listen, inhaled sharply. Moreau noticed. You recognize it, he said. She shook her head too fast. No, I thought it might be part of a customer's watch, that's all. Watches rarely carry such lines, Moreau replied, and those who own unusual objects tend to keep them close. The owner shot her a warning look, but her composure faltered. Something in the shape of the object troubled her, though she seemed unable or unwilling to explain. Moreau pocketed the metal again. He waited, he said, and when his expected company did not appear, he left. Yes. How long after did you step outside? A few minutes. Did you see where he went? No, but the owner rubbed his temples. There was a sound. A sound? A whistle, very soft, like something mechanical. Moreau felt the faint tightening behind his ribs. Mechanical? Yes. High-pitched, it came from outside. It lasted only a second or two. And the man? He was gone. Gone. Another disappearance built on the same impossible ease as the one on the bridge. Moreau looked around the cafe again. It was suddenly too still, too arranged. Every chair seemed to have been placed with care, every footprint contained by familiarity. The air carried the weight of unasked questions, the ones people refused to voice not because they feared the answer, but because they feared the asking. "Inspector," the waitress said softly, approaching him with hesitant steps. There was something else. The owner tried to stop her with a glare, but she pressed on. When he sat here, he kept his hand on the table, not moving, as if he was feeling for something. For what? She swallowed. For a mark. Moreau looked down. The counter surface was scratched and worn, yet near the edge, almost invisible, a tiny symbol was etched, nearly identical in shape to the faint lines on the metallic object. A discreet signal, a meeting point, a rendezvous conducted by people who understood how to hide within the ordinary, and something had interrupted that meeting. Moreau stepped back from the counter, absorbing the weight of the revelation. The room seemed to exhale a quiet tension as though relieved the moment had passed. But Moreau felt another layer forming beneath the surface, a web of connections he had not yet traced. He finished his cooling coffee and placed a few coins on the table. Neither the owner nor the waitress thanked him. Their silence was not hostile. It was protective, as if they feared their words might drift beyond the walls. At the door, Moreau paused. A faint echo, like a far-off metallic whistle, seemed to ripple in memory. The fog beyond the windows had thickened, swallowing the street. Somewhere in that grey veil, the vanished man's path continued. Moreau stepped out, letting the cafe door close behind him with a quiet thud that sounded like the sealing of a chapter. The fog clung more thickly as Moreau stepped out of the cafe, curling around his coat and softening the edges of the street until the world looked half-formed, like a memory refusing to settle. The metallic object in his pocket seemed heavier now, as though drawing its own path beneath the fabric. He felt its presence not as a clue, but as an insistence. Quiet, persistent, inexplicable. Ahead, the faint hum of morning traffic began to stir, carts creaking over slick stones, horses snorting as they pulled their cargo toward Leishal. But Moreau had no interest in the city's growing bustle. His destination lay in the opposite direction, toward a squat building known for its relentless precision, the Central Telegraph Office. He walked with a rhythm that betrayed neither haste nor hesitation. The events of the morning knit themselves together in his mind. The watchman's uncertainty, the cafe's guarded silence, the familiar symbol etched where no one should notice it. Each fragment, on its own, amounted to little, but taken together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. A man does not simply vanish on a bridge, nor sit waiting for someone who never arrives, unless some larger force moves around him with careful intent. The telegraph office appeared through the fog like a dark ship moored at the edge of the street, its windows glowing faintly. Even at this hour it was alive with activity, couriers entering with damp coats, clerks sorting messages with machine-like discipline, and the steady clicking of instruments behind the inner door. Moreau paused before entering, letting his senses adjust to the soundscape. For all its noise, the building carried a strange tension, like a place where every whisper left a trace, where the secrets of others passed through wires too thin to grasp. Inside, the floor smelled of ink and oil, with an undertone of cold metal from the telegraph instruments. A line of citizens waited at the counter to send messages, most of them clutching envelopes or folded notes. Moreau's presence caused a subtle shift. People in such places recognized authority instinctively and responded with the stillness of those careful not to interrupt something fragile. The clerk at the counter, a young man with a narrow face and ink-stained fingers, straightened when Moreau approached. "Inspector," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the flicker of curiosity. "How may we assist you?" "I'm looking into a telegram sent yesterday afternoon," Moreau replied. "Or rather, one that may have been sent." He paused. "A message addressed to a man whose name I do not yet know." The clerk blinked. "Without the name, it may be difficult." "Not impossible," Moreau corrected. "I believe the telegram may have been received here, but never formally logged." The young man's brows knitted in confusion. "That shouldn't be possible." "No," Moreau agreed, "and yet it may have happened." The clerk hesitated before stepping into the back room, returning moments later with a ledger bound in worn leather. He opened it on the counter, careful not to smudge the entries. Moreau watched as lines of neatly written records passed beneath the clerk's finger. Names, destinations, times, signatures of senders. Each entry fixed into place with the certainty of official ink. "Nothing unusual here," the clerk murmured. Moreau leaned closer, inhaling the faint chemical scent of the ledger. "Where is your operator from yesterday, the one who handled the late afternoon transmissions?" "That would be Monsieur Delatour," the clerk said. "He's beginning his shift now." He gestured toward a side door. "Shall I bring him?" "Please." The clerk disappeared. Moreau listened to the clicks behind the partition, a language of wires, a coded heartbeat of the city. The telegraph was a strange instrument, capable of carrying confessions, declarations of love, threats or lies, all stripped to their barest form. Sometimes he wondered whether the distance between sender and receiver made truths easier to distort. After a moment, an elderly man emerged, walking with the precise steps of someone accustomed to moving around delicate machinery. His spectacles hung precariously on the bridge of his nose, and his hands bore deep grooves from decades of working the keys. "You wish to speak with me, Inspector?" Delatour asked. "Yes," Moreau said. About a telegram from yesterday evening, a message delivered without signature, without origin, and perhaps without authorization. Delatour's face tightened, though not in surprise. Moreau noted the subtle shift, the way the man's jaw set, the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth. This was not the reaction of someone hearing a new possibility. It was recognition. "Describe the man who received the telegram," Moreau said quietly. The operator hesitated. Tall, or perhaps average height. Dressed in dark clothing, a coat buttoned to the top. He kept his collar up as if cold. "And his face?" Moreau asked. Delatour rubbed his brow, searching memory. I remember looking at him, but his face—" He spread his hands helplessly. "It is blurred, like a photograph exposed to too much light." Moreau nodded. He had expected no less. "Do you recall the content of the telegram?" "I shouldn't," Delatour admitted. "But I do." His voice dropped. "It was brief. Very brief." "Tell me." The operator swallowed. It read, "Do not cross the bridge tonight." Nothing more. Moreau felt the breath leave him in a slow, controlled exhale. "Do not cross the bridge." "Yes." "And who sent it?" Delatour shook his head. There was no sender listed. The document lacked the usual markings. "That is why I remember it. Messages like that." He paused. "They do not come through the usual channels." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Delatour said, lowering his voice further, "someone used knowledge of the system to bypass it. Someone who knew how to imprint a received stamp without submitting a sending form. It requires access, precision, and intention." "You reported it?" "No." The word came quickly, automatically. "Why not?" "Because sometimes, Inspector," Delatour said with a weary sigh, "certain messages seem designed to avoid the burden of official notice, and I have learned to recognize when I should not ask questions." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying lamp. Moreau turned the information over in his mind. A man warned not to cross the bridge. A warning ignored, or perhaps intended to be ignored. And a system manipulated to deliver a message that should not exist. "Was the man alone when he received it?" Moreau asked. "Yes." He read the telegram. He folded it once. And then he— Delatour hesitated, perplexed. He did not take it with him. Moreau's eyes sharpened. "Where is it now?" Delatour gestured toward a small drawer behind the counter. The clerk retrieved it. A thin paper slip creased once across the center. Moreau unfolded it. The handwriting was clean, almost elegant, with a deliberate slant. The paper bore the telegraph office's receiving mark, but no corresponding sending mark. It should have been impossible. "Do not cross the bridge tonight." Moreau studied the ink, the shape of the letters. The message felt less like a warning than an instruction, a command disguised as concern. "Did you notice anything else?" Moreau asked. Delatour pressed his lips together. Only that he did not seem surprised. "Meaning?" "Meaning," the old man said slowly. It was as though he expected the telegram, as if it confirmed something he already feared. A quiet unease threaded through Moreau's thoughts. He folded the telegram carefully and returned it to the clerk. "Thank you," he said. "You have been helpful." As he turned to leave, a faint sound, a metallic click, echoed from the back room. It reminded him of the whistle's thin tone, though quieter, less deliberate. He could not say whether it was imagination or memory. Outside, the fog had thickened again, erasing the far end of the street. Moreau paused on the threshold, listening to the city's muffled breath. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle, real or recalled, whispered through the air, threading itself into the seams of the morning. The message had warned the vanished man not to cross the bridge, yet he had crossed it, and now he was gone. Moreau slipped his hands into his coat pockets, fingers resting on the cold metal object. and stepped once more into the fog, toward a truth that seemed determined to hide within silence. The fog followed Moreau home as though reluctant to release him, clinging to his coat even after he left the riverfront behind and stepped into narrower streets where the lamps leaned closer, as if listening. He walked through the quiet of his quartier with measured steps, tracing the same route he had taken hundreds of times, past the bakery whose ovens had begun to warm the morning air, past the courtyard where a cat perched on a windowsill like a small sentinel, past the wooden door that always creaked in the same familiar way when he pushed it open. Yet today, the street seemed different, as if holding its breath. Moreau had felt it at the cafe and again at the telegraph office. A kind of hush, not from lack of sound, but from a surplus of meaning concealed behind everyday noises. He climbed the narrow staircase to his apartment, the wooden steps groaning gently beneath his weight. A thin sliver of light showed under the kitchen door. Madame Moreau was awake. She favored early mornings, finding comfort in the quiet hour before the world became loud. Moreau paused outside the door to collect himself. He never wished to bring the weight of his work into their home, yet he knew she sensed it regardless, as surely as she sensed the change in air before a storm. When he entered, she looked up from the stove where a pot simmered gently. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few strands falling forward in the warm glow of the lamp. She turned down the flame and wiped her hands on her apron. "You're late," she murmured. Not reproachful, simply acknowledging. Moreau removed his coat and hung it beside the door. "A case," he answered, equally unnecessary. They spoke like this often, in the softened tones of two people who understood each other's rhythms too well to require elaboration. She gestured to the table. "Sit. Eat something before you fall over." He obeyed, not from hunger, but from habit. The kettle whistled with a low, comforting note. As she poured him tea, she watched him with that particular attentiveness he had not grown used to despite years of marriage. She saw more than others, not because she pried, but because she listened with her eyes as much as her ears. "There's something on your mind," she said. "There always is." "No," she replied gently, placing the cup before him. "This is something else." Moreau wrapped his hands around the warm porcelain. For a moment, he considered deflecting, but their home was the one place where dissimulation felt both pointless and disrespectful. "There was a man," he said, speaking slowly. "Seen on Pont Saint-Michel early this morning. He stood at the railing, then vanished." Her eyebrows knit softly. "Jumped?" "No." The watchman heard nothing, saw nothing. The man was there, then not. He hesitated. He was seen at a nearby cafe the previous evening, waiting for someone, and there was a telegram, unlogged, unsent, but delivered. She tilted her head, thinking. A warning? Perhaps. Moreau reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the small metallic object. He placed it on the table between them. Madame Moreau did not touch it. Her eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition, though the kind of recognition that comes from memory without context, like a dream recalled only in sensation, not detail. "Where did you find it?" she asked softly. "On the bridge, near where he stood." She leaned forward, studying the object. Her fingers hovered above it, trembling slightly, but she did not make contact. "It's cold," she whispered, though she had not touched it. "Cold. And familiar." "You've seen one before," Moreau guessed. She drew back as if the suggestion itself startled her. "I don't know. It feels like something from a long time ago. Something I overheard, maybe. A story or a sound." A sound. She inhaled slowly, as if gathering threads of memory. "When I was a girl in the provinces, there was a station near our village. Not large, just a single platform, a waiting room, and a handful of workers. Sometimes, at dawn or in fog, there would be a whistle, not from the trains, A very faint one, high, metallic. It meant something, though no one would say what. She frowned. It used to frighten the children. What happened when it sounded? Moreau asked. People avoided the station, she replied. Even the workers seemed uneasy. I once heard someone say it was for messages between shadows, though I didn't understand what that meant. A chill crept through Moreau despite the warmth of the kitchen. He knew better than to take childhood impressions as fact, yet Madame Moreau was not prone to fanciful recollections. She viewed the world with the clarity of someone who had learned early to distinguish between imagination and real danger. "Did you ever hear it here in Paris?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not until last night." Moreau straightened. "Last night?" She nodded slowly. "You were at the quay. I went to close the shutters, and I heard it. The same thin whistle I remember from my childhood. I thought it odd, but convinced myself it was a train or a cart. But it sounded again, just before you came in this morning." Moreau felt the breath in his lungs still. "You heard it here, in our courtyard?" "Yes." Her voice trembled now, though she tried to steady it. "Short, faint, almost like a signal." Signal. The word lodged itself in his mind. He glanced at the metallic object, the strange lines etched into its surface, the absence of a mouthpiece, the uncanny weight. It no longer felt like a clue left behind by accident. It felt placed or dropped in the way a message might be dropped along a trail. Madame Moreau's gaze softened, though her unease did not fade. "You look troubled, Henri." His name on her lips grounded him. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I am troubled," he admitted, "because this is not like other cases. There is a shape forming, one I cannot yet describe, but I can feel it. A man warned not to cross a bridge. A cafe that remembers him only in outlines. A telegram recorded but never sent. And now this." He tapped the object gently with his finger. "I don't like it," she whispered. "It feels like something that should be forgotten." "Which is precisely why it cannot be," he said gently. She withdrew her hand slowly, standing to refill the kettle, though it did not need refilling. "Will you pursue it?" "I have no choice." Moreau rose from the table. The morning light had grown marginally, filtering through the curtains like pale gold dust, but it brought no warmth. He put the metallic object back into his pocket. As he buttoned his coat, he noticed his wife watching him with a mixture of tenderness and apprehension. "Be careful," she said quietly. "I always am." "No," she corrected, stepping closer. "You are always determined. That is not the same." He kissed her forehead, then left the apartment with the echo of her words following him down the stairs. Outside, the fog had receded slightly, but the air carried that same faint metallic tang he had felt on the bridge. He paused at the doorway, listening. Nothing, or almost nothing. A carriage in the distance, the cry of a vendor, the murmur of early commuters, and beneath it all, sound so faint he wondered if he imagined it. A whistle, thin, mechanical, familiar. Moreau stepped into the street, knowing that the next place he must visit was not chosen by deduction alone, but by the whisper of that sound threading through the morning. The cafe had offered silence, the telegraph office had offered paradox, but whatever waited now would offer shape to the outline forming in his mind, and he could no longer pretend not to hear the whistle calling him forward. The fog had thinned by the time Moreau reached the heart of Montparnasse, yet the light remained muted, as if the sun hesitated to fully commit to the day. The streets here carried a different energy from those around the river, quieter in the morning, louder by late afternoon, full of young artists with charcoal-stained fingers and dreamers who believed Paris itself breathed inspiration. Moreau had no fondness for such romantic notions, but he respected the peculiar clarity artists possessed. the way they noticed faces, expressions, tensions in the air that others missed. If anyone could describe the vanished man, it would be someone trained to capture the human figure with precision. He crossed a courtyard where a painter was washing brushes in a bucket, humming absently. The smell of turpentine and damp canvas drifted through the air. At the far side of the courtyard stood a modest atelier with a cracked window pane and a sign that had long since lost its letters. Moreau knocked once. The door swung open before his hand dropped. The man who appeared was neither young nor old. His hair was unkempt, his shirt smeared with pigments, his eyes alert and restless, darting from Moreau's face to his coat, the faint shadow cast behind him. "Inspector," he said, as though expecting him. "You're early." Moreau stepped inside. "You received my note." "I did, but your message was vague." "You are accustomed to filling in gaps," Moreau said. "I require your help in doing that now." The artist's mouth twitched in a ghost of a smile. "A description sketch?" "Yes, of a man seen by several witnesses, or rather, barely seen." The atelier was cluttered but orderly in its own chaotic way. Charcoal sketches lay scattered on the table, half-finished portraits leaned against the walls, and a large canvas dominated the far side of the room covered with a cloth. The artist gestured to a stool. "Sit. Tell me what you know." Moreau remained standing. "I want you to draw based on witness descriptions. They all saw him. None can recall his face." The artist's fingers froze around a piece of charcoal. "None? Not one?" The artist walked slowly to his easel. "Describe their descriptions." Moreau recited the details. The man's height, the dark coat, the way he stood at the railing on the bridge, the way he waited in the cafe, his posture more than his features lingering in people's minds. The artist listened with his head tilted, absorbing each detail not as words, but as strokes on an invisible canvas. "And his face?" the artist asked. "They remember the space his face should occupy," Moreau said. "Not the face itself." The artist exhaled, shaking his head. "That is rare. People forget many things, Inspector, but faces. Faces are anchors. Memory clings to them even when everything else slips." He sat before the easel. "We shall see what the collective mind has retained." He began to sketch. Quick strokes at first, loose and searching. Moreau watched the charcoal move across the paper, marking shadows before outlines, depth before detail. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the scratching of charcoal. Then the strokes slowed. The artist leaned back, frowning. "This won't do," he murmured. He tore the page off the easel and let it fall to the floor. Moreau bent to retrieve it. The drawing showed a man's silhouette. A coat, a hat, the faint bend of a shoulder. But the face was a smudge, as if erased by a thumb. The artist began again. Another sketch, another frown, another discarded sheet. The third attempt took longer. He paused often, lifting the charcoal, squinting at the air as though searching for an image just beyond sight. Moreau waited, hands clasped behind his back. When the artist finally stepped aside, the drawing was clearer than the first attempts. But the face remained incomplete. No eyes, no mouth. Only the faint suggestion of cheekbones, barely hinted at in shadow. "This is the best I can do," the artist said quietly. "You are capable of more detail when the subject exists," Moreau replied. The artist bristled. "Do not insult my craft. I drew what the witnesses placed in their minds. Nothing more can be extracted." Moreau lowered the sketch. "What is your impression of him, without accuracy, without constraint?" The artist considered. "He feels deliberate, a man accustomed to moving without being seen, someone who learned to reduce his footprint, not literally, but perceptually." He tapped the paper. "He doesn't hide. He simply doesn't present." Moreau pondered that distinction. Not hiding, not presenting. It aligned with the watchman's uncertainty, with the cafe's uneasy silence, with Delatour's blurred recollection. "Try once more," Moreau said. "I will try," the artist replied, "but I warn you, some faces refuse capture." He set to work again, this time with deep focus. The strokes grew slower, more deliberate. He began with the shape of the head, then the angle of the jaw, then the shadows where eyes should sit. But just as the features began to form, something in the artist's expression tightened. His hand faltered. The charcoal snapped between his fingers. Moreau stepped forward. "What is it?" The artist stared at the broken charcoal, his breath shallow. "I saw something," he whispered. "A detail." "Which?" The artist swallowed. "Around his neck. Very faint, like a thin cord, or a strap. Holding—" He hesitated, but his eyes drifted to Moreau's coat pocket, as if drawn by the object hidden there. "A whistle," Moreau said softly. The artist's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in recognition. "Yes, I think that was it. Not a whistle like the police carry. Something older, stranger." Moreau withdrew the metallic object and placed it gently on the table. The artist recoiled slightly, not from fear, but from the uncanny familiarity of it. "I've seen marks like that," the artist muttered, pointing to the faint engraving. "In old railway sketches. The kind they made years ago, when stations were still built from stone and iron, before modern signals replaced mechanical whistles." He frowned. "This is not a common object, Inspector. Whoever carried it wanted to be known only to those who understood its meaning." Moreau felt the air shift. "Then the witnesses did not fail in memory," he said. "The man intended to remain unresolved." The artist nodded reluctantly. "He resisted form." Moreau gathered the sketches. In each one, the man's posture grew clearer, while his face dissolved further, as if the details were being erased by the very act of drawing them. The last portrait seemed almost defiant, as though the absence of features carried its own silent meaning. "Inspector," the artist said, lingering at the edge of the room, "men who leave no portrait. They do not do so accidentally. They belong to circles where identity is a liability." Moreau held his gaze. "Criminal circles?" The artist shook his head. "Not necessarily. Sometimes circles that operate in the spaces the law does not see." Moreau slipped the metallic object into his pocket and gathered the sketches. "Thank you." As he stepped toward the door, the artist added, "Be careful whom you show that to. Some objects invite attention, others summon it." Outside, the fog had almost lifted, leaving a pale sky above Montparnasse. Yet the world felt no clearer. Moreau walked with the sketches tucked under his arm, the metallic object pressing insistently against his side, and a growing certainty that the man on the bridge had lived his entire life within the thin margin between presence and erasure. A man without a portrait, a message that should not exist, a whistle that should not be heard. As Moreau approached the boulevard to hail a cab, he felt it again. That faint, metallic tone, so distant it might have been memory, yet so sharp it cut through the morning air like a question that the city, in its silence, seemed unwilling to answer. By late afternoon, the river had shed the last of its morning fog and now shimmered under a pale, uncertain light. The sky hovered in that in-between shade of grey that Paris often wore before rain. Neither dark nor bright, but expectant, as though the clouds were listening. Inspector Moreau walked along the sign with a steady stride, his hands in his coat pockets, the portraits from Montparnasse tucked safely beneath his arm. He felt the weight of them even though the paper was light. Faces that refused to be drawn had a way of weighing on the mind. The riverbanks were alive now. Barges moored against the stone walls creaked with the shifting current. Boatmen shouted to one another as they moved crates of produce. Vendors with push-carts sold cheap flowers, roasted chestnuts, or thin strips of tobacco. Even the beggars seemed more alert, watching the flow of people with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Yet woven through the ordinary hum of life was another rhythm, quieter, submerged beneath the surface. A rhythm of half-heard stories, glances exchanged between strangers, and the uneasy awareness that something had shifted in the city's undercurrent. Rumors, like river mist, collect where the ground is uneven. Moreau approached one of the boatmen unloading crates of fish near the Pont Neuf. The man's beard was thick, his arms tattooed with symbols from forgotten ports. He looked up, squinting beneath the brim of his cap. "You're the inspector," the boatman grunted, "the one who asks the wrong kind of questions." "The right questions are rarely welcome," Moreau replied. The boatman snorted. "Depends on who's listening." Moreau showed him one of the discarded sketches, the one where the man's posture was the clearest. "Have you seen someone like this on the river in the last day or two?" The boatman studied it, his brow furrowed. "Looks like half the men who pass through. Could be nobody, could be everybody." He handed it back. "But there's talk." "What kind of talk?" The boatman wiped his hands on his trousers as though preparing to speak words he'd rather keep to himself. "They say a man was seen near the abandoned customs building last night, the old one by the Quai des Célestins. Stood there for a long while. No movement. Just standing like he was waiting for a signal." He hesitated. "And then he was gone." "Gone how?" Gone," the boatman said gruffly. "Like your drawing there. No one saw him leave. He just wasn't there anymore. My cousin swears it. He watches the river at night." Moreau folded the sketch. "Did he hear a sound? A whistle?" The boatman stiffened. "You know about that." "Tell me." The boatman leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's been a whistle on the river at night. High, metallic. Not from the boats. Not from any instrument I know." His voice roughened. "Some men say it's a signal. Others say it's a warning. A few say it's the kind of thing you don't want to hear twice." "And the man on the bridge?" "Maybe he heard it," the boatman said. "Maybe he followed it." He straightened and added gruffly, "But I've said enough." People nearby had begun to glance over. River dwellers were sensitive to the flow of conversations. Secrets traveled faster on water. Moreau walked on, deeper into the labyrinth of alleys near Ile Saint-Louis, where the river narrowed and the wind carried the murmured stories of those who lived in its shadow. An elderly woman selling violets tugged at his sleeve. "You're looking for someone," she said, her voice cracked from years of cold mornings. "I am." She nodded as though this confirmed something she already believed. "They said a man walked along the river last night with no shadow. The lamps lit him from behind, but he cast nothing on the stones." Her eyes flickered nervously. "That's not natural." "People don't lose shadows," Moreau said gently. "They do," she whispered, "when they're meant to pass unnoticed." He watched her carefully. Her hands trembled not from fear, but age. "Did anyone else see him?" "The paper boy," she said. "He told me this morning. He's too young to lie well." Moreau handed her a coin for the violets. She tucked them into his coat pocket with a small, grateful nod. He continued toward the eastern edge of the river, where the less traveled paths lay, places where the city seemed to forget itself. These areas, full of old warehouses and half-abandoned structures, were fertile ground for rumor. Two dock workers leaned against a crate, sharing a cigarette, their voices low. Moreau approached. "Gentlemen," they straightened warily. "I'm not here to trouble you," he said. "I need to know if you've heard anything about a man disappearing on the bridge this morning." One of them exhaled slowly. "You're the inspector, the one from the quay?" "Yes." "Well," the man said, flicking ash onto the stones, "there's been talk about a group. Old group, not police, not criminals. Something in between." He shrugged. "Maybe it's nonsense." "Stories often carry truth inside nonsense," Moreau said. "They say some men vanish when they want to." He tapped his temple. "Special training. Old tricks from the provincial rails, from the days before electric systems. Back when communication was done with signs, whistles, codes in the dark. And this group still exists?" "I don't know." The man glanced at his companion. "But last month, in Chartres, a man disappeared from a station. Same way, no noise, no witnesses, just gone." He lowered his voice. "The press didn't print it, but we hear things." Moreau's pulse quickened. "Any connection to this?" "Maybe. Maybe not. But the whistle?" He shivered. "Some say it calls men away. Others say it warns them. Hard to tell." Moreau thanked them and moved on. He needed distance, space to think. The river ran beside him, steady and indifferent. Its voice drowned the city's constant hum, allowing him to gather his thoughts. A man who leaves no portrait. A message sent, but never sent. A meeting interrupted. Witnesses who remember only. Outlines. A whistle heard in 2 provinces, and now a shadowless figure. The shape forming in Moreau's mind was no longer merely an outline. It was becoming a pattern, one not bound by the city nor the present moment. He walked north toward a narrow passage that led to the Quai de la Tournelle. As he passed beneath an archway, a thin boy, no older than 12, called out, "Monsieur, Monsieur le policier." Moreau crouched slightly to meet him at eye level. "What is it?" The boy pointed to the sketch Moreau had tucked under his arm. "I saw him." Moreau's heart shifted. "When?" "Last night. Before dawn. He came from the bridge. Walked past me. Didn't look at me, but—" The boy hesitated. His coat didn't move. "What do you mean?" "It was windy. My cap flew. His coat should have moved too, but it didn't. It just stayed still." Moreau stared at the boy, the city's sounds thinning into a faint hum. "And," the boy added, voice trembling, "I heard something when he passed. Like a whistle too quiet to be real." "Did he cast a shadow?" Moreau asked. The boy shook his head slowly. "No, he didn't." A faint chill crawled down Moreau's spine. He stood, placing a coin in the boy's hand. As he walked away, the river's murmurs seemed to shift into a whisper shaped like the memory of that whistle. A warning, a summons, or something older, something moving beneath the city like an unseen tide. Moreau's pace quickened. The answers, if they existed, lay not in the river's rumors alone, but in the origins of the whistle itself. And for that, he would need to go someplace where craftsmanship spoke louder than testimony. To the workshop on Ile Saint-Louis. The bridges of Paris always held stories, but none more ancient than those of Ile Saint-Louis, where the narrow streets wound like veins through the island's stone heart. As Moreau approached, the late afternoon light dimmed behind clouds swollen with unshed rain. The world felt suspended, held in that peculiar hush that comes before a storm. His steps echoed against the cobblestones, each footfall a quiet announcement of his intent. He had visited this island countless times, interrogated shopkeepers, followed suspects, chased rumors into dark corners. But today, he came seeking something rarer than testimony, the truth behind a crafted object. He crossed the Pont Marie and entered a lane where the buildings leaned inward as though sharing secrets. A faint, metallic clinking reached him, irregular, soft, rhythmic. It guided him to a modest workshop tucked between a bookseller's stall and a shuttered grocer. A small sign hung above the door, worn so smooth by weather that it no longer carried words, only the shadow of what had once been carved there. Moreau pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of iron filings, oil, and the faint warmth of worked brass. Shelves along the walls held gears, springs, and precise instruments of various ages. At a bench near the window sat a man hunched over a vise. his long fingers guiding a thin file along a tiny mechanism. He did not look up immediately. Craftsmen rarely interrupted their work for anything less than catastrophe. "You're late," the craftsman said finally, his voice low and rough from years of inhaling metal dust. "I expected you sooner." Moreau raised a brow. "You knew I was coming. I knew someone would." He set his file aside with care. "I heard that whistle last night. Twice. Those who know its sound also know what follows." The man turned. His hair was streaked with gray, his face sharply lined, but his eyes, bright, pale blue, held the precision of someone accustomed to examining the world through details others overlooked. "What do you know about it?" Moreau asked. The craftsman gestured to a stool. "Sit, but show me the object first." Moreau took the metallic piece from his pocket and placed it on the workbench. The craftsman did not touch it at once. Instead, he observed it from a distance. After several seconds, he lifted it delicately with a small cloth, holding it to the light. The faint etchings caught the glow from the window, casting tiny shadows across the metal surface. "Not many of these remain," the craftsman murmured. "Most were destroyed after the accidents, or after the disappearances, depending on whom you ask." Moreau leaned forward. "Explain." The craftsman sighed, rubbing his thumb carefully across one edge. "This is not a whistle in the usual sense. It was part of a signaling device used decades ago, before modern telegraph lines reached the smaller provinces. Stations in remote towns relied on sound signals in heavy fog or during storms. But the device was not meant for public use. It was reserved for internal communications between station masters, track guards, and inspection teams." "Inspection teams?" Moreau echoed. "Yes, special personnel trained to monitor routes and keep the line safe in dangerous terrain." The craftsman set the object down. "But some stations developed practices of their own, codes, signals for issues they did not wish recorded on official logs." Moreau felt his pulse shift. "Unofficial signals." "Yes, and this," the craftsman tapped the metal lightly, "was used to activate those signals. When fitted into a larger mechanism, it produced a sound that carried miles across fog-covered fields, a sound distinct from any train or worker's whistle." "The sound I've been hearing," Moreau said quietly. The craftsman nodded, lips tightening. "It's faint now, but unmistakable." Moreau folded his arms. "The sound seems to appear around disappearances, on the bridge, near the river, even in my own courtyard." The craftsman exhaled slowly. "Then you're dealing with something old. Something that should have died with the stations that used it." "Tell me everything." The craftsman stood and moved toward a cabinet filled with small wooden drawers. He opened one and retrieved a folded sheet of aged paper. When he laid it on the table and smoothed it, Moreau recognized it as a schematic. Detailed, hand-drawn, labeled with elegant pen strokes. "This is the original design," the craftsman said, "from a provincial station near Bourges. The signaling mechanism included 3 parts, a resonance chamber, a pressure release valve, and the activator, the piece you now possess." Moreau traced the lines with his eyes. "What was the purpose of the device? Beyond communication?" The craftsman hesitated. "Officially? To alert workers of incoming dangers, rock slides, unstable tracks, storms." "Unofficially." He looked directly at Moreau. "It was used to guide certain men along routes no one else traveled, men whose work was never spoken of." "Inspection teams?" "No, men outside the system." He lowered his voice. "There are stories, old stories of individuals capable of moving through stations without being recorded in logs, who passed between towns unnoticed. People said they were messengers for a forgotten bureau, or agents who handled matters too delicate for police or government." "Rumors," Moreau said. "Rumors often start with truth," the craftsman countered. After the tragedy at Saint-Aignan-sur-Cher, the system was dismantled. Moreau's breath caught. What tragedy? 5 station workers vanished during the night shift. No blood, no sign of struggle. Only an empty platform and the whistle's lingering echo. The newspapers printed a brief note about operational restructuring. But those who knew the truth burned the devices. Or tried to. Moreau touched the metallic object. Yet this one survived. Yes, the craftsman whispered. Which means someone intended it to. A silence fell between them, heavy as the dust hanging in the sunbeam drifting through the window. Moreau felt a chill radiate from the object, though he knew it was only cold metal. This vanished man, the craftsman continued. The one you're searching for. He may not have been running. He may have been answering a call. A call from what? From whoever still knows how to use this device. The craftsman tapped the schematic. Whoever still remembers its codes. Moreau felt the pieces forming a larger shape. Rumors in the cafes, the telegram that warned without sender, the boy's description of a coat unmoved by wind, the shadowless figure along the river. All separate threads until now. And the whistle's sound? Moreau asked. It was never meant to be heard by accident. Its frequency was designed to travel through fog, sometimes too well. Meaning? Those who recognized it would follow. Without thinking, the craftsman paused. It was said to be a signal of summons. Summons, the word settled into. Moreau's mind, like a stone, dropped into deep water. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, though the room seemed suddenly colder. And what happens to those who follow it? Moreau asked. No one knows, the craftsman replied. Or if they do, they've chosen silence. Moreau collected the metallic object from the table. It felt heavier than before, heavier with history. Where does the sound originate now? He asked. The craftsman hesitated before answering. I hear it from the direction of the old customs building near the river, he said quietly. The place the boatman mentioned. Moreau stood. Then that's where I must go. Inspector, the craftsman said, voice low, you should understand something before you go looking. What? Those who vanish by the whistle's call don't always leave traces for others to follow. They fade because they must. Moreau studied him. And you believe the vanished man was one of them? I believe he was chosen, the craftsman said, or summoned, or hunted. The distinction hardly matters to those who don't return. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cold against the stones. Moreau placed the object back into his pocket, thanked the craftsman, and stepped into the street, where the island seemed suspended in silence. The whistle's faint echo, whether real or imagined, followed him as he walked toward the river, toward the old building where all the threads would converge. The rain came slowly at first, a thin mist softening the air as Moreau crossed back toward the right bank. But before long, it gathered into a steady fall, drumming against shutters and umbrellas, turning the cobblestones into slick mirrors that fractured the lamplight. Paris always felt narrower under rain, its silhouettes shrinking, its voices dampened. Tonight, the city seemed not only smaller but watchful, as if aware that Moreau moved toward something it would rather keep hidden. He followed the river eastward. The Seine churned with rainwater, its surface shivering under the relentless descent. There was no fog now, only the gleam of reflections and the dark weight of night settling early. Moreau's coat grew heavy, but he did not slow. The metallic object in his pocket pressed against his thigh through the layers of fabric, a cold, unyielding guide that pulled him toward the Quai des Célestins. He had been to the old customs building before, in cases that drifted near the edges of legality, smuggling rings, unregistered shipments, quiet favors exchanged between men who pretended not to know one another. The building, long abandoned, still bore the architecture of officialdom, high-arched windows, stone columns stained by decades of damp, a facade cracked by neglect, yet unmistakably imposing. It had the air of a place that once demanded answers, even if now it offered only more questions. As Moreau approached, the rain slackened. The building loomed against the river like a ship run aground. Its doors were locked with rusted chains, but the side entrance, always the forgotten one, stood slightly ajar. No wind moved it. It waited, as though expecting him. He stepped inside. The darkness was immediate and thick, broken only by faint, erratic light filtering through the high windows. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling into shallow puddles on the floor. Crates lay stacked against the walls, some broken open, their contents rotted away or stripped long ago by thieves. Moreau walked deeper, his footsteps echoing, the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer surprised by the unexpected. Then he heard it. The whistle. Not loud, not urgent. A thin metallic thread of sound that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It stretched through the empty chambers, like a voice trapped in an underground passage. Moreau froze. The sound was neither the soft whistle of wind nor the shrill cry of a train. It was unmistakably the same frequency he had heard on the bridge, in the courtyard, and described by the craftsman. It was the summons. The sound ended abruptly, leaving a vacuum that made Moreau's pulse loud in his ears. He moved toward the source. At the far end of the hall, an inner door stood half open. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor with walls stained by old water leaks. The air grew colder as he moved forward. He felt the faint pull in his chest again, a sensation more instinct than deduction, as though the sound that had ceased still echoed inside him, leading him. The corridor opened into a large chamber. Moreau stopped. The space was vast, almost cathedral-like, with a vaulted ceiling and tall windows whose glass had long since cracked or fallen out. Rain dripped through the openings in thin, irregular lines. The walls bore faint markings, dusty scratches, nail grooves, soot streaks, none significant on their own, but together forming a tapestry of forgotten activity. Yet what struck Moreau most was not the room itself. It was the feeling within it, a presence, not of a person, but of an event. Something important had happened here. Not recently, but not long enough ago to be erased. Moreau stepped forward. His boots splashed softly in shallow puddles. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, rusted metal, and something else. Something like the ghost of oil used in machinery long disassembled. He scanned the room and saw the papers. A charred pile of them, burned hurriedly, not thoroughly, lay in the corner beneath a broken window. The edges had curled, blackened, but some pieces of text remained visible. Moreau crouched, lifting one fragment. Handwritten notes, lines drawn, columns of numbers, the faded outline of a station. He sifted through the pile, piecing together scraps, mentions of transfers, unnamed personnel, coded symbols that matched the faint engraving on the metallic object. Someone had tried to destroy the evidence, but not well enough. A gust of wind blew through the window, rustling the remaining pages like dead leaves. Moreau stood slowly, scanning the room again. Then he saw them. Footprints, faint, nearly invisible, preserved in the thin layer of dust that covered the chamber floor. They led from the center of the room toward a darkened alcove near the far wall. The prints were unusual, light, precise, as though made by someone who walked with careful intention, leaving almost no trace. Moreau followed them, each step drawing him deeper into the shadows. The alcove opened into a small room, windowless, once used for storage. Moreau illuminated it with a small match struck against the wall. The flame cast a trembling halo of light across the space. It revealed a table. Not much more than a plank balanced on crates, but upon it lay an object that tightened Moreau's throat. Another whistle piece, identical to the one he carried, except this one had its mouthpiece intact and a cord. A thin, worn cord, as if someone had worn it around their neck for years. Moreau's match burned close to his fingers. He shook it out and struck another. He examined the whistle. Its metal gleamed faintly, even in the darkness, as though polished recently. The cord lay coiled beside it like a small sleeping snake. Someone had left it here, deliberately. His hand hovered above it, then paused. A noise behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Only the rain dripping in the main hall, only the echo of his own breath. But someone had been here recently. He felt it in the air, sensed it in the subtle warmth of the room. He struck another match and lifted the whistle. Its weight was slightly heavier than the one in his pocket, as if the completed mechanism held some invisible tension. The engravings were sharper, more defined. The cord felt worn, but not frayed. And then the match went out. The room fell into darkness. Moreau stood still, listening. Drip, drip, drip. Somewhere in the building, a door creaked, not from wind, from movement. He stepped back into the main chamber. The faint whistle sounded again, farther away now, faint as a whisper under breath. Not calling him, calling someone else. Moreau quickened his pace, emerging from the alcove with the whistle clutched in hand. He followed the sound through the chamber and back into the corridor. The building seemed alive with shadows now. Corners shifting, echoes following too close, the air trembling as though saturated by the whistle's resonance. He reached the central hall. The whistle sounded a third time, and Moreau saw the silhouette, tall, still, facing the river through a broken window, a dark coat, collar raised, a hat low over the face. The man. He was unmistakable. Not because Moreau recognized him, but because he embodied the absence that had haunted every witness's memory. A hollow outline anchored to the world by only the suggestion of a figure. "Stop," Moreau called, though the command was instinct, not strategy. The silhouette did not move. The whistle's echo lingered in the air, a fading thread between worlds. Moreau stepped forward, but as he approached, the silhouette dissolved. No sound, no movement, no trace. Just the rain, falling through the gap in the window, pooling where a shadow should have stood. Moreau reached the spot. There were no footprints, no marks, only the faintest smell of cold metal and the whisper of something ancient passing through. He looked down at the whistle in his hand, its cold weight anchoring a truth he could not yet articulate. Some vanishings are chosen, some are summoned, and some are absorbed by the very silence that calls them. The building felt emptier now. Not abandoned. Emptied. Moreau turned away from the window, his breath slow, controlled. He slipped the second whistle into his pocket beside the first. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. The river waited, steady, indifferent. As Moreau stepped back into the night, he understood that he had reached the end of the visible thread, but not the end of the story. Some truths remain beyond the reach of reports. Some stay hidden in the fog of memory, and some linger in the thin sound of a whistle that only certain men can hear.